Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In the next two podcasts, we are going to feature a king I am supposing that you have never heard of. Were I to say this about any number of kings, you might cry foul. Most of my listeners would readily admit that there are quite a few kings mentioned in the Bible that are hardly household names. Most people that paid any attention at all in Sunday school would have at least a passing acquaintance with Saul, David, and Solomon. Some might even know a little something about Jeroboam, Rehoboam, Ahab, Hezekiah, and Josiah. But beyond those characters, our knowledge gets a little thin. However, I am not talking about obscure kings whose stories are found in the books of Samuel, Kings, or Chronicles. Instead, I am talking about King Abimelech. Again, I am guessing that you are not familiar with this man in the least. Of course, one could overlook ignorance of this man if he had been a king of Judah or Israel in the monarchy period, even if he did not get much press. But King Abimelech had the distinction of being Israel's very first king. He even precedes Saul. His story is told in Judges chapter 9. Perhaps as much as anything, that explains his obscurity. This is because Judges is one of the least familiar books in the Bible. Except for Deborah, perhaps Gideon, and Samson, the book of Judges remains something of a mystery. Nevertheless, King Abimelech's story occurs in Judges, chapter 9 to be exact. Of course, at the outset, it is fair to ask, why is a story featuring a king in a book that features people called judges? That is a fair question. First off, we have to explain what is meant by the word judge. For English-speaking people, a judge is in charge of court proceedings and judicial protocols. A judge either interprets laws put into force by legislators or implements those laws on behalf of a county, city, state, or even country. Judges in the book of Judges do nothing of the sort. The only person in this book that even comes close to the ordinary sense of judge is Deborah, who was said to hear cases the people brought before her. That's in Judges chapter 4, verse 5. Aside from that brief reference, none of the principles in this book engage in jurisprudence. This raises the question, why are the main characters in this book called judges in the first place? In this instance, judge is a word that suggests a person who executes sovereignty in behalf of a larger entity, like a city, like a community, or some larger group. In the book of Judges, the principal characters are asked to act in behalf of the people Israel when Israel is being oppressed by a foreign power. In that sense, a judge is someone who executes sovereignty for Israel's sake. Virtually every judge whose story is told in this book is summoned when Israel is under someone's thumb. Most of the judges in the book of Judges engage in military activity of one sort or another. We might refer to them as military virtuosi. In light of this background, we revert to the original question. Why is there a story about a king of Israel in a narrative that focuses on judges, these military operatives? Well, we need to explain a little bit more about these judges. I have already mentioned that they come to the fore when Israel is suffering oppression from foreign entities. What is really interesting about this, however, is that this oppression has been instigated by Israel's own God. Every single episode of oppression is a form of divine judgment for Israelite sin. As a matter of fact, Israel's sin and a corresponding act of judgment is part of the whole literary pattern that characterizes the entire book of Judges. This pattern has 6 elements that appear like clockwork throughout the whole narrative. First, Israel sins. Sometimes that is all we are told. At other times we learn the nature of the sin. Idolatry is the most common form of sin. Second, when Israel sins, God gives them over to foreign oppression. Third, as time goes by, Israel eventually cries out because of how terrible the oppression has become. Fourth, God hears Israel's cries and summons a judge to deliver them from the foreign group that is tormenting them. Fifth, the judge rises to the occasion, defeats the oppressive power, and gives relief to the people. Sixth, we are told at that point that Israel entered a time of peace when they were no longer subject to a foreign power. As I said, however, this is a pattern. This means that it happens over and over and over. In fact, from Judges 3 through Judges 16, this pattern depressingly repeats itself with terrible regularity. One more item needs to be brought up. God always selects a brand new judge to deliver the people. Once the judge has done what she or he had to do to rescue the people, the judge basically disappears. The next judge would be called when circumstances dictated it. This is what makes the story of King Abimelech so intriguing. He broke this pattern, or at least tried to do so. Here is how. Abimelech was the son of Jerubbaal, another name for Gideon. Gideon was the more famous name. Gideon acquired this name when he desecrated the altar of Baal, a famous Canaanite deity. Jerubbaal means something like, "Let Baal contend." That was a way of slandering Baal. In any case, the nickname stuck. For the most part, Gideon was an Israelite stalwart. He had saved Israel from Midianite oppression. Indeed, he was so successful that Israelites wanted his family to remain in power. That would, of course, violate the manner in which God selected judges as they were needed. But the Israelites did not care, so they approached Gideon with an offer. The people asked Gideon to establish a kind of dynastic system such that after he had ended his rule, his son would take over, and after that, his grandson would reign, and so forth. But Gideon would have none of this. He rejected the offer outright. "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." That's in verses 22 and 23 of chapter 8. Clearly, Gideon understood the dynamic of the whole system of the judges. God was the ultimate ruler, the judge only the instrument. This may have been Gideon's finest moment. Unfortunately, right after this, he deviated himself and became idolatrous. Still, this background has to be kept in mind as we come to the Abimelech episode itself. It is also important to keep in mind that Gideon had 70 sons. In any dynastic system, that would have been a quite difficult circumstance to navigate, perhaps even impossible. However, since the system of judges did not involve dynasties, the number of sons should not have mattered. By the way, 70 sons were the result of multiple wives, and that's the many wives that Gideon had, according to verse 30 of chapter 8. As it turned out, though, the many sons did become a problem. It was a manufactured problem, nevertheless a problem. Abimelech was the manufacturer. Here is how the story goes. Abimelech's mother was a concubine to Gideon, which meant that she was a wife, but perhaps having somewhat lesser status. She lived in Shechem, where Abimelech was born. When he was grown, he went back to Shechem to speak to his mother's relatives. He spoke to the whole maternal clan, and in the process asked a disturbing question. He wanted to know whether his relatives thought it would be better to be ruled by Jerubaal's or Gideon's 70 sons, or only one of those sons. That's in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 9. Not only was this question disturbing, it was strange as well. There was no expectation that any of the former judges' sons would rule. Gideon had made that clear. So Abimelech offered the people a false choice by implying that they would have to deal with a gigantic oligarchy if a single person was not designated to rule. Then Abimelech played the relationship card. He told the inhabitants that by virtue of his mother, he and the townspeople were relatives. His mother's kin bought this sales pitch and in turn persuaded other citizens. Before long, Abimelech had a following. Declaring him as their quote-unquote brother, the people in the city also bankrolled Abimelech so that he could hire a gang of toughs to demonstrate a little muscle. They got the funds from a shrine to a Canaanite deity. That's in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 9. With these funds and the backing of a group of goons, Abimelech went to his father's house and without compunction murdered every single one of his brothers. They're his half-brothers, but nevertheless. That's in verse 5. According to the text, he did this on one stone. This was an unimaginable slaughter. Though Abimelech thought he had taken care of all his brothers, who he imagined would have threatened his political ambitions, miraculously, one of them managed to escape. Jotham, Gideon's youngest son, had somehow hid successfully. After this murderous action, Abimelech went back to Shechem, where the citizens proceeded to make him king. It should not be lost on us that no one thought to consult the Israelite deity in any of this. God had been all but forgotten. As soon as he got the chance, Jotham, the escaped son, went to Mount Gerizim, a place in the earshot of the people of Shechem. What he said constitutes one of the most anti-political statements anywhere in the Bible. To make this astounding diatribe, Jotham told what amounts to a parable. We'll call it a parable of the trees. Here is how it goes. The trees once decided to anoint a king. That's in verse 7. To do this, they went to the olive tree and asked it to rule over them. But the olive tree refused. Instead, the olive tree pointed out that the product it supplied honored both gods and people. The olive tree found that vocation more satisfying than ruling over the trees. That's in verses 8 and 9. Rebuffed, the trees then went to the fig tree, requesting that it assume the position of ruler of the trees. The fig tree also rejected this offer. Like the olive tree, the fig tree was very fulfilled by offering sweet fruit. The fig tree did not believe that ruling over the trees would enhance its life. That's in verses 10 and 11. Because the trees had failed to get a ruler twice, they tried a third time by going to the vine and making the same offer. But the vine was no more interested than the olive and fig trees had been. The vine was the source of cheer for gods and people. Ruling over the trees did not seem all that attractive. So the vine said simply, no. That's in verses 12 and 13. Almost in desperation, the trees went to a bramble bush. They asked the bramble if it was willing to rule over the trees. At long last, the trees got a positive response. The bramble replied, "If in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon." That's in verses 14 and 15. The response of the bramble deserves some commentary. First, it should not be lost on anyone who heard this parable that only the unproductive tree was the least bit interested in ruling. A bramble produces no fruit of any kind. At best, it might offer a little shade or be used for kindling. Second, the bramble's reply intimates a possible violent posture. Unless this offer is being made in good faith, the bramble might start a fire that will consume the cedars of Lebanon. The cedars of Lebanon were almost legendary as a resource for quality wood in the ancient world. The bramble was unimpressed. It would not shrink from being a destructive force, threatening this valuable resource. Third, the bramble said nothing about any benefit that would accrue to its rule over the trees. Instead, it issued a thinly veiled threat that its rule would be all about the bramble and not about the trees. When Jotham finishes the parable of the trees, he speaks to Shechem's citizens. His interpretation of the parable is hardly subtle. He made it clear that the Shechemites only acted in good faith if they had honored the deeds of Gideon, who had done so much for them. That's in verse 16. Of course, immediately Jotham accused the Shechemites of not acting in good faith, precisely because they had anointed a king who was responsible for the senseless and brutal slaughter of Gideon's 70 sons. That's in verse 18. The only criterion that they used for this appointment was the fact that Abimelech was ostensibly related to them. That was the man's only qualification. Because of this egregious selection of Abimelech, it would not be long before the kingship ends in violence. As noted, one of the uses of a bramble is to provide something that is flammable. Those flames would soon be visible. After delivering this blistering parable and its pointed interpretation, Jotham fled and hid from Abimelech. That's in verse 21. We will see the aftermath of Jotham's parable, its interpretation, and Abimelech's kingship next week. In closing, though, I want to accent the delicious irony of Abimelech's name. In Hebrew, the name means, "My father is king." The name has two connotations. One is, "My divine father is king." That would make this name equivalent to Elimelech, "My God is king." At the same time, the name is perfect for a prince. "My literal father is a king, just as I will be one day," is the implication. In Abimelech's case, the name is ironic in another sense. His literal father, Gideon, expressly refused the office of king, even when Israelites begged him to be their king. That suggests that Abimelech's name had to do with the divine father being king. We will see next week whether the divine father, namely the Israelite deity, will exercise that kingly rule in favor of Abimelech or work against Abimelech, who had just become Israel's first king. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and let me know what your email is so that I can contact you when we are ready for the mini courses. As I mentioned before, that I'm almost done with the menu for the first year's courses. Also, if you want me to ask me any question for a future Q&A time, go to my email fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.